Well, good morning, everybody. As Dan mentioned, we are in the very last week of a series that we've called Choose a Side, and it's been a series completely focused on missions and outreach. And missions and outreach is something that is core to who we are as Community Church, so it's been a wonderful, wonderful month together as we've looked back at the Bible. In fact, if you've missed any of these last few weeks, I would strongly encourage you can go online and give any of these messages a listen as we've looked for how can we as a church, how do we as a gathering of people, how do each of us individually share and show the love of Jesus to those around us, especially to those who are in need. And as we've journeyed together through this over the last few weeks, last week we looked at it's not just an opportunity to love others, it's not just a responsibility to love others. We get to love others because Jesus first loved us 2,000 years ago by sacrificing himself on the cross. And that's why we get to do what we do. So I am so excited to have you here today. In fact, there's two reasons you should be glad that you're here today. First is that unlike these last couple weeks, you do not have to listen to me talk for the next 10 or 15 minutes. Yeah. See, Dan is excited about that, and you should be too. I'm excited about that as well. Second reason you should be excited to be here is that we have one of our dearest partners Back2Back with us this morning to share with us. And if you haven't heard of Back2Back, they're an organization that about 2.5 years ago, a member of our congregation connected me with a gentleman named Casey Foreman. Casey is somewhere. Where are you, Casey? Where are you? Yeah, Casey is in the back there. You can clap for him. That's fine. Casey is vertically challenged, so if you didn't see him during that part, you could see him after in the back. A gentleman introduced me to Casey, and Casey and I began to talk, and I don't know if you've had those times in life where you meet someone for the first time and it seems like you've just been friends with them forever. That's kind of how I've always felt with Casey, and we as a church have been so blessed to partner with Back2Back over the last 2.5 years. In fact, the video that you guys saw to start our time together right now, that was a video that last year we shot. 22 of us went over to Hyderabad, India for a whole week to spend time at an orphanage there that they run. And if you couldn't tell, we were having the time of our lives. We were only a couple days in. We were very jet lagged. Our dance moves were lacking. I don't know if you saw that. Our dance moves were not quite there. We had such an amazing week there. I think one of the things that every team member would tell you is that it was amazing to see what God did through us, but it was more amazing to see what God did in us. And we left pieces of our heart back there with those kids that week. So I am so excited to have Back2Back with us today and for them to share the burden and the passion that God has given them for orphan care around the world. So if you'd please help me welcome Beth Guckenberger from Back2Back.
Good morning. Oh, I love being in Indiana. I was just sharing with him. I was born in Indianapolis. I'm an IU grad, so this is feeling like I came home here. My name is Beth, and I'm just going to share with you a couple of stories. I'm really just a storyteller, and I'm going to tell you the stories that took me from what my husband and I were doing after graduation from IU and how we found ourselves with a heart broken for the orphan and what resulted. So we went back to Cincinnati, Ohio after we graduated from IU, both of us did, and we were teachers there, and we had the summers free, so our local pastor said, why don't you take high school kids, you obviously like them, on summer mission trips. So we did that through the summers of like 93, 4, 5, 6. In that summer of 1996, we saw on our mission trip something that upset us, that bothered us. We were feeding orphans these hamburgers that we were really supposed to be partnering with this church painting a wall, but it wasn't going very well. So we kind of hijacked that trip and we got in a taxi cab and found an orphanage, and the kids hadn't had meat in over a year. And so we brought some hamburgers to feed the kids there. And while we were there feeding kids hamburgers, there was this little preschool girl who, I mean, she was so cute. And my husband pointed her out to me. I was just back behind the griddle serving hamburgers as fast as I could to the kids. And he said, did you see that little girl? And I said, I can't keep my eyes off of her. And he said, well, I think you took your eyes off of her a few times because she's been in your line like 4 or 5 times. And I don't know any preschoolers that can eat that much. So the next time she came up for a hamburger, I grabbed her hand She led me to somewhere. I didn't know where we were going, but we got to the edge of the door frame of her dorm room, and she dropped my hand, and she went, like, kind of scampered off with her little preschool buddies. And there I could see they were lifting up their mattresses, and they were sticking their hamburgers underneath them. And I called Todd over to that door frame, and we just sat there watching these kids hide this meat under their mattresses, and we just thinking to ourselves of all the people that we knew, really, between Bloomington and Cincinnati, that we thought might possibly buy hamburgers for orphans if they knew who they were and where they were and how to get it to them. We came back home from that short-term trip, and we did leave a piece of our heart there, and we just kept thinking to ourselves, what do you do with what you, what do we do with what we saw? How do we act the same when we didn't feel the same anymore? So we were in a little season where we had double income and no kids. You know, that little tiny time when you make more money than you really actually need. Today, Todd and I have 11 children, so that season's way in the rearview mirror. But in that time frame, we thought, well, let's just live off of one of our salaries and stick the other one in a savings account and just at least be financially prepared if God would ask us to do something about what it is that we saw. So for a whole teaching year, we lived off one salary, put the other one in the savings account. At the end of that year, we felt this sense that we were supposed to move to Mexico. Like we were supposed to go there, go back to what we had seen, and at least learn the language and develop relationships, maybe start a foundation. And this is before the internet, really. So we bought a book on how to move to another country. And in that book, it said you need to take currency in small bills so you can easily exchange it. So I remember queuing up at our bank in Ohio and telling the teller when it was my turn, I'd like to liquidate my account in cash. It was a 1 year of a teaching salary, so you know about the size of my account. So I said, I'd like all of our account in cash, please, preferably small bills. And when you ask for your account in cash and small bills, they alert the bank manager. So he came out and he said, what are you doing with all your money? And I said, well, I'm moving to Mexico. And he's like, why don't you come back in my office for a minute? So I went back in his office, and he talked me into doing something we don't even really do today anymore, but he talked me into turning that whole account into traveler's checks. So Todd and I put those traveler's checks in a safe, and we put that safe in the middle of our truck, and we drove. It takes 3 days to get from Ohio to a city called Monterrey, Mexico. And during that drive, we were saying to each other the answers that people had been asking us in the months leading up to that date, like, what are you going to do, and how are you going to do it, and who are you going to do it with? And we had all these questions, actually more questions than we had answers. And when you find yourself in a place where you have more questions than you have answers, that's actually kind of the center of mission. When you're in over your head and you recognize you don't have what it takes, like that's I now know that's actually the fingerprint of God. At the time, it was like all we could say is like we have this sense of peace about it, even though it didn't make sense externally. The New Testament is written in Greek, and the Bible talks about 3 kinds of ways of love in the New Testament, and one of those words in Greek that represents love is agape love. Agape has this giant definition, but the part of that definition I like the best is that agape love is compelled to act. Like you don't really even understand what and why and who and when and where, and you don't really have any of those answers. You just have this compulsion to do something for someone else. And I bet that that's been the outcome for many of you in the course of the last month as you've been hearing about different opportunities and partners for missions and outreach. You can sense that agape love. That's the kind of love that put Jesus on a cross for us, right? He was compelled to act on our behalf. And when we identify ourselves as Christ followers, he deposits that heart inside of us, and then we now feel compelled to act on behalf of people that we don't know, we don't understand, we might not even be able to talk to, we might not otherwise have any interaction with, but we have this compulsion to go to them. That's how we were feeling. We got there to Monterrey, and about a week after we got there, it was time to turn our traveler's checks into pesos. And so I queued up at a bank in Monterrey called Banorte, and it was my turn finally in front of the teller. And a weekend, all I knew how to do was count to 10, really. I didn't have any language skills. I could also order from the local McDonald's because we had eaten a lot of it that week. But I was my turn in front of the teller, and there's like a little glass like wall between you and a teller in a third world country, and a divot at the bottom, and then like a squawk box kind of that you talk through. And I was just taking the peso, the traveler's checks out of my backpack and sticking them underneath that glass divot because the guy told me in Ohio, give these anywhere around the world, they'll give you back local currency. So I'm just shoving them over to her, hoping she'll return me a bunch of pesos. But the lady started to give me some instructions. I didn't know what she was saying. I now know she was saying something like, tienes que firmar tu nombre allá en la línea, ponte el nombre allá en la línea. And it made noises just like that. Like I could hardly understand her. It was like Chinese. All I know is that she was returning those checks to me. So I kind of irrationally returned them to her. I'm thinking to myself, if these things don't turn into pesos, like we can't even drive home to Ohio. So I give them back to her. She shoves them back to me, and she starts to talk real slow and loud the way that people do when you think they don't understand you. So she's shouting at me, firma tu nombre allá en la línea, ponte tu nombre, allá en la línea, ponte tu nombre en la línea. I said to my husband, I think that she wants our passports. I bet she wants our IDs. So I stick my passport on top of all that, shove it over to her. It's not what she wants. She gets kind of hysterical. She's like, ponte el nombre a la línea, and she's going on, and all of a sudden I thought, I think I've heard that word. She's saying a lot. I think this week I heard someone say that, and so I asked Todd for a pen and paper. I'm like, hey, give me a pen and paper. I think I know what she's saying. So he hands me pen and paper, and I write the word nombre on a piece of paper, and I show it to her through the glass. She's like, mm-hmm. And then she points to the line at the bottom of the checks. So I picked up my pen, and I wrote on every one of those lines the word nombre. Nombre. She, of course, was inviting me to sign those checks, right? To put my name down there on that line. One of my favorite verses in the whole of the Bible comes from the book of Zechariah. It's chapter 4, verse 10, and it says, do not despise these small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices to see the work begin. Like, Jesus did not look down at me that day and go, oh my gosh, I'm totally sent the wrong girl. She's going to be a terrible missionary. Like, she can't even cash a traveler's check, right? Jesus was looking at me that day, and he saw all the experiences and lessons that I'd had that led me to that moment. And he saw all the chapters that were yet to come. Today in 2019, Back2Back Ministries will transfer $11 million in rupee and naira and peso in different countries around the world. But if I just got up here and told you this chapter of the story, you might be tempted to give credit to the wrong person. But you definitely cannot give credit to the girl who couldn't even cash a traveler's check. In fact, we stood in a long line of people throughout biblical history who were ill-equipped and immature and underprepared, and God loves to use us in our weakness, because then he gets all the credit. He gets all the glory of the story. He's really looking for two things from us. He's looking for us to be faithful to him, and he's looking for us to be available. And if we will be faithful and we'll be available, there's actually nothing he can't accomplish through us in our cities, in our country, and around the world. And in 2018, I want to be honest, this does not happen in January of every year. Like, I think some people this might happen to, but sometimes, people talk about God gave them like a word for the year or whatever. I got this word, I felt like in 2018 that God gave me. And it was that kind of extra cool because it was in Hebrew. It was this word we say, Haneni. Haneni it's a Hebrew word that we translate in English as here I am. So you'll see it 8 times in your Old Testament. Think like Moses is in front of the burning bush, right? And God calls down to him, Moses. And Moses just responds with that singular word, Haneni, in the scriptures, here I am. Or Abraham's on his way up a mountain in Genesis 22, about to sacrifice what he thinks will be his son. And the Lord calls down to him, Abraham. He responds, Haneni, here I am. But in Hebrew, it really means a little bit of a fuller meaning than here I am. It really literally means whatever it is you're about to ask of me, I'm already in agreement of it. And I kept telling people in 2018, I want this to be the year of Haneni. I want this to be the year when I don't count the cost, where I don't say I'm too busy or too old or too young or too whatever. I'm too tired. I'm too any excuse I could possibly come up with. If God calls my name, I want this year for me to say yes, whatever it is you're asking of me. I'm in agreement of it. I'm not going to count myself out. I'm going to trust you that this is what you have for me, and that whatever questions that I have about being in over my head or not knowing who or when or where or how come, I'm going to trust it's your fingerprint in that storyline, and I'm going to run to it instead of shrink from it. So I kept telling people, Haneni, Haneni, all last year. Halfway through the year, I got a chance to be in Israel, and I was talking to the Hebrew guide, and I'm like, hey, just checking in with you. I've been telling people about this word this year, and I just want to make sure, am I saying it right? Am I teaching it right? Could you just verify it all for me? And he goes, no, that's right. You're doing it right. And he goes, there's a place in the Bible where the Lord says Haneni to you. I said, there's some place in my Bible where the Lord says to me, whatever it is I'm asking of him, he's already in agreement of it. Tell me where that is. He tells me to open up to Isaiah chapter 58.
Isaiah 58 says, "Is this not the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and to break every chain, to share your food with hungry, to provide the poor wanderer with shelter when you see someone naked to clothe them, and to not turn away from your own flesh and blood." Like this is mission. This is the kinds of things you've talked about from the last month, inviting people to your table, seeing where people are hungry physically, spiritually, relationally, where people are oppressed, where they need their chains broken. Like when we get busy doing God's business, when we find ourselves in the middle of his mission, then this is what happens. Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry out for help, and he will say, "Hineni, here I am." Whatever it is you're asking of me, I'm already in agreement of it. And I'll just tell you, Todd and I ended up living in Monterey for the next 15 years. We've now been doing this over 20 years. This is the story of my whole life on mission. I am in over my head all the time. I've realized that being ill-equipped and immature and underprepared was not something unique to my 25-year-old self. I actually have felt that pretty much every month since. That when you get busy doing the kinds of things that God asks you, you're going to realize very fast you are too tired and too busy and too old and too young. You are not enough. You aren't smart enough, wise enough, patient enough, self-controlled enough, loving enough, joyful enough. Like you will come to the end of yourself. But God has this deal with us that in the midst of us being busy about advancing his kingdom, that we can call out to him for help. And whatever it is that we're asking of him, he'll be in agreement with us. For us, when we first got to the mission field, all we could see were physical needs, right? Like we could see orphans who needed things like protein and screens on their windows and better schooling. And we started to meet their physical needs, and that felt very missionary-like when we got there. And then about a year later, our language skills kind of caught up, and we made sure they knew that we were doing all these things, not for our benefit, but because God loved them and saw them. And that definitely then felt very missionary-like, meeting physical needs in a way that gave the glory and credit to God in the midst of it. And we kind of puttered along in that way for a couple years, and it felt really strong and good to meet tangible needs of people that I knew that God had set aside specific promises for in Scripture. And then some of the kids in our orphanages were leaving the orphanage around age 15, and they were going off and making babies with their counterparts in a world that wasn't kind to them. And we were watching those second generation babies coming back to the orphanages that the kids grew up in, and we were like, this does not feel good. Our tagline is that we provide care for today and hope for tomorrow. And I'm like, this is good care for today, but this is not very good hope for tomorrow. If they just turn around and repeat the cycle that they had been handed from the generations before, like where's the hope for that in that? So then we decided we were going to take the kids and take them beyond what the government mandated in education. So basically almost everywhere in the third world, it's somewhere around that 13, 14, 15-year-old age. We were going to take them beyond that, and we were going to help them get higher education, high school, and then maybe even college we were dreaming about. And we started in 2002 something called the Hope Education Program, where we did that very thing. We began to take kids all the way into the highest levels of education that they were capable of. Many, 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 many of them through their bachelor's degree in college, and that felt phenomenal. Like, okay, now that's the secret sauce. You got to meet physical needs, make sure they know it's because of Jesus, and then break the chain through education. And we puttered along in that world for a while. And then one of our first college graduates came for dinner at our house shortly after he graduated. And he was telling Todd and I that we were asking him how his new job was, and he was telling us he was about to quit. And I was like, well, quit? You have a great job. Why are you quitting? And he goes, well, there's this guy. He's driving me crazy. He follows me around all the time, and all he ever does is tell me what to do, and I can't stand it. And Todd goes, is he your boss? And he goes, yeah, I can't stand it. And I was like, oh my gosh, we graduated a well-educated, emotional train wreck. We had not addressed sufficiently issues of authority and men in his life. And we were like thinking at this point, okay, we had it all figured out. No, we did not. We had not adequately addressed the issues of trauma that were going on in his life. And that started us on a journey to touching some of the emotional pieces and the emotional trauma that are in kids' lives. Today we have something called the 5-Point Child Development Plan, where with every child that we serve around the world, we meet their needs physically and spiritually and emotionally and educationally and socially. And I always say that if I'm on a stage in 10 years and I say we have the 5-Point Child Development Plan, you should kick me off. There's probably a 7-Point Child Development Plan, right? I mean, the truth of the matter is we're on a journey always to be as students of God's word and of his best thinking. And we're going to continue to do and leverage everything that we have to help kids that are a part of this vulnerable population. God wrote these unbelievable promises for orphans in the Bible, that he's going to come to them and hear them and lift them up, make them a home and execute true justice on their behalf and maintain their cause. And it goes on and on. He loves them so much, and he's invited us as a church to be the hands and feet of those promises as we demonstrate his love to them. Today, we know that of the 2 billion children that are on the planet today, that 50% or 1 billion children on the planet today have experienced trauma. And that number is only going to exponentially grow without intervention. But here's what we know for sure. What we've got to do is put a safe adult in the life of every one of those children, and that number starts going in the other direction. Because a redeemed life, as your 21-member team can tell you from their visit last year to Hyderabad, a redeemed life is brilliant to look at. It's a strong testimony because the natural way of things got interrupted by something supernatural, and what they then can talk about and testify to, it points to a creator stronger than anything I can ever imagine. And we believe when safe adults get involved in the life of kids from trauma, then we get the opportunity to build a platform on which the gospel is put on display. There's this story in Mark that I really like. It's this story about Jesus is in this town. It starts kind of at the end of Mark 4. He's standing in a town called Capernaum. He's with all his disciples, and he points across the Sea of Galilee to a town that's on the top of a huge cliff. The town was part of the Decapolis, and he tells his disciples, hey, I want to go over there to that town over there in the Decapolis. And the disciples, all we know in the Bible is that they got in the boat and they went over there. But we know that the folks in the Decapolis, they were worshiping the gods of fertility and wine. So you can imagine what their 9 o'clock services look like, right? Not like this. And we also know that Jews in the first century considered large bodies of water metaphorical for the abyss. So they were going to have to cross over the abyss in order to get to the Decapolis, something they would have been fearful to do. But they obeyed despite those two obstacles. They obeyed. They got in the boat. They got halfway across that abyss, and the abyss did to them exactly what it does to us when we tell Jesus yes. When you respond to that compulsion in your heart to do something for someone other than yourself, you're going to find the opposition kicking itself up against you. In Mark chapter 4, it came in the form of a storm. But I bet if I circled up the 21 folks who went to Hyderabad last year and I asked them, what kinds of storms came into your life right prior to you going on that trip? They'll have some stories. This is what happens. We have an enemy against this way of life, this work that we have as supernatural children of God. Anyway, Jesus taught all of us who want to read Mark chapter 4 what to do when the opposition comes against us. He silenced them with the words out of his mouth. Today we have the words out of his mouth. The power of the word of God against that enemy demands that he leave, that he flee. He gets over in Mark chapter 5 verse 1 on the edge of this town of the Decapolis, and he's met by this guy that the Bible calls Legion, because he was possessed by a legion of demons. He had been chained up to a graveyard. Like at one point he'd had friends and family, but they chained him up to a graveyard as if he was already dead. And emboldened by those demons, he broke from those chains, met Jesus there. Jesus is looking at him, knows exactly what's going on. He sees over to his side 2,000 pigs, because we now know the folks in Decapolis were sacrificing pigs on the altars of the gods of fertility and wine, so that's why there were a bunch of pigs there. Jesus casts those demons into those pigs go flying off that cliff into the sea, and suddenly the guy goes, I don't know who you are, but I want more of you. I want to be with you, whoever you are. I want to go with you. And when I read my Bible, I'm wanting Jesus to go, great, get on the boat. That's not what he does. In Mark chapter 5, it says, as Jesus was getting back into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him, but Jesus didn't let him go. Instead, he said to him, I want you to go home to your own people. Like, these are the people that just chained him up, right? Go home to your people. Tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. So the man went away, began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. When Jesus got back in his boat, he crossed back over that abyss, and he goes back home to Peter's mother-in-law's house there in Capernaum. And the first time my heart wrapped itself around that story, I thought, I can't believe it. He did all that abyss crossing for one person. And he wasn't even the most important person in the town. In fact, he was the most unwanted, given up on, cast out member of that whole community. That reminds me of a shepherd that had 101 wanders away, and instead of thinking 99 is good enough, he decides to leave the 99 to go after the one. This is the heart of Jesus who lives in us and compels us to go after the one in our lives and across borders and all the places that he takes us. And if that's all I knew about Jesus, that might be enough for me. But we can read a little bit later in that book, you'll see that Jesus will pass through that town again on his way to Jerusalem for Passover, and it says he's met there by a crowd of believers. So already there's some first fruit hanging off the tree of this brand new missionary who used to be known as Legion. If you Google that story, you can see that archaeologists have excavated some plaques that they date back to the 1st century, sometime in the first 100 years after Jesus died. Those plaques in that area were for 2 Christian physicians who were martyred for giving their services to the poor. And I literally love that 2 people captured the gospel story so compellingly from this man that they gave eventually their life for it. If you Google again, in the year 400 AD approximately, a man named the Bishop of Decapolis would pen something that this morning will be said in churches on 7 different continents called the Nicene Creed. And that's all fruit hanging off of the tree of a man that nobody wanted. When I think about the kind of work that God might ask us to do, it might not make sense to anybody else. And it might feel like a lot of work and a lot of abyss crossing and a lot of opposition for one person, but that's actually how I think this works. And he has a place in it for all of us. There might be some of us that are goers and some of us that are givers. I wanted to share with you this morning the story of one woman who was God asked to pray. When I was living there in Mexico, we were foster parents, and I had some lovely foster children, but I had one that was not so lovely. She was actually more work than the rest of my household ever was combined. I don't know if you've ever interacted with a teenager like that before. It wasn't fun anymore. I heard God on the shore of my little Capernaum tell me to cross an abyss, and I got halfway across the abyss, and the storm was very hard. And I was ready to say, I'm not going to do this anymore. And we had her for about 3 years before she finally prayed to receive the Lord at age 15. I can remember looking over at my husband when she accepted the Lord, and I was like, oh my gosh, the rapture is imminent because, baby, it is finished, right? I couldn't believe it. And it wasn't like everything was totally magically better, but we suddenly were sisters in Christ, right? And so the story changed a little bit. The year that she became a Christian, the following summer, we had a church visiting us on a short-term mission trip, and I didn't know anyone on that trip. But a man and his daughter came up to me after church and asked me if I had time for a story, and I said, yeah, I have time for a story. And he said, did you ever meet my mother? Her name was Barbara Shaw. And I was thinking to myself, I don't even know you. How would I know your mother? But I did. My best missionary voice. I was like, I don't think I've met her, no. And he said, oh, she's from your hometown, and she's kind of known for being an intercessory prayer warrior, and I thought maybe you'd met her sometime or you'd heard of her. And I said, you know what, you're right, people have told me before they've passed on our requests to her, so I don't know her, but I do know of her gifts. And he said, well, she passed away this spring. And I just said, I'm sorry for your loss. He goes, yeah, do you remember when you guys did an art auction? And I said, yeah, definitely. We had a girl visit us from Des Moines, Iowa, who's very gifted in oil painting. She asked me at the end of her week for a stack of photographs I gave her. She turned some of those photographs into art. Then she shipped those from Des Moines, Iowa to where our headquarters are in Cincinnati, Ohio. And then we auctioned those off at a fundraiser to benefit the orphanage that she had visited. And he said, somebody bought one of those paintings and gifted it to my mom. It was a thank you to her because she had been praying for their child who had been sick and in a hospital. He said that painting hung above her couch for the last couple of years. In fact, I think it's like the last 3 years, he said. He goes, the last year she's been pretty much confined to that couch. And people would come over and visit her and say, like, are you ready to go home? And she'd go, I'm not ready to go home. I'm still working. I'm praying for my grandchildren and my pastor. And she would go through her list of people she was praying for. He said at the end of her life, she realized what was happening. And she asked me if I would, after she passed, take that painting and hang it in my house. And she said to me, I don't feel like I'm done yet praying for those children that are represented in that picture. And I don't know what it looks like when you get on the other side of eternity. So would you take the painting to your house and would you pray for those children? And he's like, what do you tell your dying mom? You're like, yes, I'll take the painting. And he said, but the truth is I don't have her gifts. And I just feel like I say the same thing every day and I don't really know what to do. So here's what I did. I took a picture of the painting. I'd like to show it to you right now. And I'm hoping you can tell me a little bit about the children that are in it so I can pray more specifically. And Jesus and I start having this little conversation like, the girl's a good painter, but like facial features. And like, what if I don't really recognize them? You know, and I'm telling the Lord, like, what if I tell him like a representative story, right? And then between his prayer life and your heaven, you just fix it and apply it to the right kids. Like, I don't know if I can tell him I don't know who they are. Like, Lord, but he gives me no green light for deception, right? So I'm like not getting any yeses. And so I called some of my children over because they know the kids in the children's homes, and I thought maybe they would help me recognize who the child was. So I pulled them all around me, and I'm like, Mr. Shaw's going to show us this picture, and we're going to try to see who they are. Anyway, he pulls this picture out of his Bible and he kind of leans over for us to look at. And as soon as I saw it, I said, get your pen and paper out right now, because it was a picture of my foster daughter. I brought a picture of Barbara here. I recognized that picture right away. That picture was a picture that was in our house. I don't know how it got in that stack of photographs. I don't know. It wasn't supposed to go to Des Moines, Iowa. I don't know why it got chosen out of all the ones that we gave her and got painted and got sent to Ohio. I'm not sure why that family, who I never even met, chose to purchase that painting and give it to Barbara Shaw, who I never met on this side of eternity. But when I found out she had been interceding for 3 years for the children in that painting, I said to him, do you understand that your mama co-labored with me in the salvation of this little girl? Do you understand that the shepherd loved the lost sheep so much? And he saw me struggling in the middle of that storm so much. It says that John 3:16, he so loved the world. He's such a lover. He so loved the world that he used someone in a missional story who never left the Ohio Valley. Like, your part in this story might be that you get on your knees and pray for the thing that God has compelled you to act towards. Or you may share resources, or you may board a plane. I don't know what you're going to do, but God has a plan for all of us. I'll close with this story. I was on the way here thinking, I want to tell them about this Indiana boy that I met. So we had a team from Lebanon, Indiana, if you know that farming community above, I think, Indianapolis. They came on a trip, and at the end of their trip, I was kind of challenging them to take the things that they had seen that week and make this a springboard into 51 more weeks of mission. That mission trips are not like a check of the box and you can spend 51 weeks the way you want to, because for 1 week you gave it up. I'm like, this is your springboard. And I was challenging them. I said some kind of rhetorical question like, ask the Lord what you're good at and what he might do with how he's already gifted you. And this boy in the front row, 10 years old, did not want to sit through my talk. And so he said, can I be excused? I'm not really that good at anything. And I said, well, I'm sure you're good at something. And he's like, no, I'm not good at anything. Can I go? And I said, no, I'm sure you're good at something. And he's like, Xbox. And I'm like, okay, good. Well, then you sit here and ask Jesus what he can do with your Xbox. So he sat through my talk, and I kind of had forgotten that exchange a little bit. And about 6 or 7 weeks later, we got a letter in our office with a money order for $410 from this boy. He had gone back to Lebanon, Indiana, and organized an Xbox tournament where he had a $10 entry fee, and he had 41 participants. And he got some local businesses to donate prizes, and he wrote me a letter about what happened when he asked God what he could do with an Xbox. And then he told me exactly what he wanted his $410 to be spent on. And I think to myself, when we tell God, I'll be faithful and I'll be available with whatever it is I have in my hand, there's no telling what on earth he's going to do. the people he's going to introduce us to, the places we're going to be, all we know for sure is we will quickly get in over our head. We will quickly feel like we're ill-equipped, immature, and underprepared. We will quickly get to a place where we don't have the answers to all of our questions, and it won't be neatly tied up in a bow, and it won't make sense to the world, and those are the things the Bible tells us for sure are going to happen. But when we get in that place, we can trust that he's in it with us. And when we cry out to him for help, his response to us will be, "Here I am." Thank you.